Hi there, Chris here with another fresh tip for you all. In this video, we're going to continue our look at painting a corpse grinder cult model from Necromunda Dark Uprising. In the previous video, we worked on the white of the cloth and gloves and helmet, and now we're going to work on the flesh. Ricard's flesh is what we're going to use. I slap a little bit onto my palette, use my brush, just the dampness of the brush, to thin the paint out ever so slightly and begin applying this over the flesh areas. Now, there's not a lot of flesh areas, and we're working on this before we get onto the armor, just because reasons. That's really about it. Again, you can see we're just basically applying this. Now, I apply this over the flesh areas instead of using contrast paint, which some most likely would do. But I find when you apply the flesh paint, contrast paint over the Gray Sear Prime spray, I find that it just takes on a bit of this weird tone, and I don't really care for it. So that's the reason why we're using Ricard. And I want a nice dark flesh tone, so Fire Slayer flesh is what we're going to use here, and I'm basically applying it in a fairly generous fashion, allowing it to do what it does, where it falls into the recesses, gives us a nice little deep tone. And you can see, again, it's applied fairly generously, but I do go back and pull some of the excess contrast off some areas, you can see there. And again, I just use it and move it into some more shadowy points where I want a little deeper tone. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward using this kind of stuff. After a while, I noticed that I really wasn't happy with how overall it didn't sit on the surface. So I began applying it deliberately into recesses and folds and everything like that. And so basically I use a little bit of a feathering technique where I just basically apply it down and then just feather its edge to create a slight transition and gradient into those areas. And I do about 2 or 3 extra layers into those areas, just again build a bit more strength in those tones. We come back with some Ricard flesh and a Lamian medium. Slap a little bit onto my palette, just basically a drop, just to thin it out ever so slightly, just to maintain consistency. I could just use water, but I find with the medium, especially when I'm going to bust into some edge highlighting, and basically I just want to make sure that the paint stays nice and viscous and applies onto the model in a very consistent fashion. So that's the only reason I use the medium. But otherwise, you could use water in this regard, especially if you're used to using water. Feel free to continue to use water. But basically it is just Ricard flesh thinned out ever so slightly as we build it up. And of course, when we're thinning it out as well, we could basically build it up like a glaze if we're going to take our time with it. I'm being very quick with it, really. And of course, you see there, just really fast, I laid it out onto the rest of the model. Flayed One Flesh is our next color here, and this is going to be applied in a fairly careful fashion. Again, we're just applying it just inside where we had previously laid our layering of Ricard flesh. Again, this is just to build up our highlights, create a bit of a slight gradient, and I'm going for just the high points on the muscles, as well as kind of applying it in a bit of a line fashion. Again, trying to imitate the striation in the muscles. You can see here really quickly, just laid it down all over the flesh areas. Then we're going to come back in with some Gilliman flesh. We're going to use some contrast medium. We're going to thin this down, a ratio of roughly 1:1, because again, the contrast paints are fairly thin already and they're transparent. And all we're doing here is reestablishing the flesh tone. And so we're going to apply this fairly generously over the flesh. And you can see here how it knocks back those really abrupt highlights. Again, if you apply it in this fairly generous fashion, it will creep into the recesses, again deepening with those other tones previously with the Fire Slayer, but otherwise it just gives us a nice deep dark flesh tone with a little bit of contrastiness. If you apply some excess, get some into any other areas, as you can see there, just quickly wash your brush off and draw that excess out. But otherwise, that is it. That is the flesh of our corpse grinder cult model. Stay tuned as we work on the armor next. Huge thank you to all my patrons. Without their support, a lot of these videos would not be possible. If you're considering Patreon support, click the link in the description below, and that's a huge thank you. You can support at many levels, and so take care of them brushes, and they will take care of you.